So our lecture series today for the Layton Heritage Museum is on the Layton Sugar Factory. And our presenter is Ted Ellison. Ted grew up here in Layton, and he had 4 other siblings besides himself, so there was 5 total. And we have his sister, there were 6. Okay, there were 6 total. And we have with us today one of his sisters, Catherine Firth, and another one of his brothers is Captain John Cooley Ellison, who is one of the names that appears on the Vietnam Memorial Wall, like we have here in Layton. Ted's grandfather, James E. Ellison, started working at the Layton Sugar Factory in 1915. His father started working there in 1932 and was the last president and general manager of the factory. His dad was also on the Layton Town Board and served as Layton mayor. Ted spent so much time in the sugar factory growing up that he says he feels like that's where he grew up. He attended Davis High School, and because his brother was MIA at the time that Ted was drafted, he served in the United States Army but was stationed stateside so that the family wouldn't lose another son. In 1975, Ted and his wife, Shauna, opened Main Street Station, which was the first restaurant in the old train station that now houses Cafe Sabor and had a couple of other restaurants in between. They ran that restaurant for 11 years. Ted worked as a Davis County Sheriff, or in the Davis County Sheriff Department for 35 years, and he and his wife together have 7 children. We're grateful that Ted is taking the time today to tell us about the Layton Sugar Factory.
Thank you, I hope. Just a little bit nervous, but we'll get through it. When originally Bill Sanders asked me to give this, back before the COVID hit, I said, yeah, I'll participate, but I've got to be able to bring my toys. So here they are. I've collected Layton sugar my whole life, just about. But we were in a really great position living out front and hanging out at the sugar factory most of the time. And so it was a great opportunity for me. And then with my dad's association with it, I ended up inheriting some of his records, photographs, and drawings. As I started to prepare for this, and it's kind of a book report on a book that hasn't been written yet, so no, I'm not looking to do that. I started out by identifying 5 people, 5 men that I figure contributed most significantly to its founding, its longevity of 44 years, and the reason it was located in Layton. And they are Jesse Knight, James E. Ellison, LDS Church President David O. McKay, and my dad, Harold Ellison. The story starts out as, and this was one that I hadn't heard, so I thought you guys maybe would like to hear it today, with a magazine article in Frontier Times of 1969. And in there's an article written by George A. Thompson, who is a Utah author on ghost towns and lost treasures. And the article is entitled, "The Mormon Wizard." The only mining camp in the West without a saloon. That's what they called Knightsville, Utah. Located in the fabulously rich Tintic mining district, it was a most unusual boom town. Saloons were prohibited by law, and miners weren't allowed to work on Sunday. But probably the most usual of all was that it was Uncle Jesse Knight's town, lock, stock, and barrel. Jesse Knight was born in Kirkland, Ohio in 1845, made the long, hard journey across the plains to Salt Lake City in 1850, with his widowed mother and 7 small brothers and sisters. Even as a barefoot boy, herding cattle in the foothills, he was the man of the family. He was working in a sawmill when he was only 16 years old and freighting to Nevada mining camps a year later. Knight's mother was a devout Mormon, and although she tried to raise her children in the church, she found that young Jesse had little interest in Mormonism, and following his marriage, he often spoke against its beliefs. It was after he had been married for several years that his favorite daughter died, and his youngest child was extremely ill. His wife pleaded with him to call the church elders and join them in prayer for the child's recovery. At first he refused, but finally relented when the doctors abandoned all hope and vowed that if the baby's life were spared, he would pledge his life and the fortune of the church, his life and fortune to the church. Almost as if a miracle had happened, the sickness passed away and Knight found his future pledged to the Mormon church. And you'll have to bear with me here because I'm not used to this PowerPoint, and I'll try and stay up with it. Not long after his child's recovery, Knight turned to prospecting, and one day he sat resting on the slopes of Mount Godiva. He heard a voice say to him, "This country is here for the Mormons." He interpreted the strange message as a heaven-sent sign and located a mining claim on the rough mountain face not far from where he had heard the mysterious voice. Knight had faith that his claim would be a rich one, but friends only laughed, and there had never been any minerals found in that area before. Knight asked Jared Roundy to help him stake the claim, and as Roundy was writing out the location notice, Knight told him to put his name on it as half owner, but Roundy answered, "I want no party of such a damned humbug." When he asked what name to put on the location notice, Knight answered, "You have just named it. We'll call it the Humbug." Month after month, Knight worked at his humbug claim without finding any sign of ore. Still, he believed that his fortune was there. Finally, to speed work on the claim, he mortgaged his home, hired 2 miners to help him and his son, Will, with the work. For weeks, they drilled, blasted a tunnel deep into the hard rock of the mountainside, going deeper into debt at the same time. Then one day, to his son's surprise, Knight said, "Soon we will have all the money we need, and in time, we will save the credit of the church." Young Will was amazed, for they were deep in debt, had uncovered no ore, and it was said that the Mormon church owed debts of more than $1 million. It was August 1896 that the great ore strike was made in the Humbug Tunnel. Miners Thomas Latham and Thomas Mansfield had drilled a round of holes, and when they returned to the end of the 150-foot tunnel to dig out the blasted rock, they discovered a full face of glistening ore. Assays revealed that it averaged 4 ounces of gold, 175 ounces of silver, and 34% lead to the ton. Knight did not appear in the least bit surprised, but acted as if he expected the strike to be made that very day. Filling a wheelbarrow with a rich ore, he wheeled it from the tunnel and turning to his son remarked, "I have done the last day's work I ever expect to do, where I take work from another man. From now on, I expect to make employment for others." Before news of the rich strike got out, Knight quickly located a group of mining claims around the humbug, including the Godiva, Colorado, Beck, Iron Blossom, Dragon, and Uncle Sam. His strange powers bordered on clairvoyance, also led to the discovery of rich ore in his newly staked claims. At the Uncle Sam claim, a tunnel was driven through barren rock for 350 feet without finding a pound of ore. The miners were questioning the wisdom of digging further when, for no apparent reason, Knight ordered the direction of the tunnel changed, and with only a short distance, a vein of rich silver was found. At the Beck Tunnel, the same thing was repeated at 300 feet when the tunnel's direction was ordered turned 90 degrees and broke into a great body of ore 40 feet thick. It was the same story at the other claims. Soon Jesse Knight was known throughout the mining world as the Mormon Wizard. In only a few months, his income soared to over $10,000 per month, and production from the mining claims his friends once laughed at totaled over $10 million. He became the Mormon Church's greatest tithe payer, never forgetting the vow he made when his prayers were answered. Jesse Knight became a millionaire many times over. He started a whole group of new companies, often just to create employment in places where it was needed. Among his far-flung ventures were the Layton Sugar Company, the Knight Bank, the Spring Canyon Coal Company, and several ranches and co-op stores, and the Knight Woolen Mills. The following is a short history I compiled of the Knight Sugar Company and the start of the Layton Sugar Company from this book, Ephraim P. Ellison, Enterprises, Life and Enterprises. LDS communities were extending into Canada in the early 1880s. Wealthy church members were encouraged to participate in helping these early settlements thrive. Church President Joseph F. Smith introduced Utah County mining magnate and investor Jesse Knight to Layton businessman Ephraim P. Ellison. Together they formed and managed the Knight Sugar Company on prairie land that soon would be known as Raymond, Alberta. The town site was named after Knight's son, old Raymond Knight. In July 1901, Jesse signed a contract to purchase more than 200,000 acres of land to build a sugar factory and a town site to support it. This also included the Bar K2 Ranch on the surrounding nearly 30,000 acres. The contract stipulated that the factory would be operational by 1903 and would continue to operate for at least 12 years. History would note that EP didn't even know Jesse Knight at the time the contract was signed. Now I'm going to see if, yeah, here we go. About 1890, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints became very determined to produce the much-needed commodity of sugar. Unsuccessful attempts to refine sugar at Sugar House, Utah in the 1850s brought frustration to the Latter-day Saints. The problem was how to chemically change molasses into refined sugar and how to deal with the high alkaline beets produced in Utah soil. They continued to pursue the venture after the successful production of refined sugar by E.H. Dyer in Alvarado, California in 1870. In October 1891, black molasses was turned into refined sugar at Lehi, Utah, and the sugar factory expansion, or rather explosion, in Utah started. In Utah's history, there have been 19 sugar factories operated by various companies, including Untitled Sugar and the Amalgamated Sugar Company. In 1902, E.P. Ellison served on the newly formed board of directors for the Amalgamated Sugar Company, and I think that occurred about 1897. And just happened to be on that board at the time it was suggested that the two maybe should partner up, because Jesse Knight had a lot of things going and a lot of money to invest, and he couldn't be running a sugar factory in Raymond, Alberta. The Amalgamated had recently built 3 new sugar factories in Weber and Cache counties. To this point in his life, talking about E.P. Ellison, his expertise seemed to be the Farmers Union of Layton since 1882, the Layton Milling and Elevator Company since 1890, and vice president of Davis and Weber County's Canal Company. E.P. Ellison entered into an agreement with Jesse Knight that he would oversee the construction of the new factory at Raymond and manage it for a few years. Living in Layton, Utah, and traveling to Raymond, Alberta by train 6 to 8 times a year must have been a tremendous task, because I think that's quite a ride to get up there. As E.P. had done with his other businesses, he used his older sons to manage his business ventures. Morris H. Ellison was sent to Raymond to be the resident manager of the factory. James E. Ellison was serving an LDS mission during much of the startup of the factory and spent 1906 in the San Francisco earthquake. The factory was operational in October of 1903 and produced 40,100 pound bags of sugar in its first campaign. Because of the very successful first year, stockholders agreed to buy out and absorb the Knight Ranching Company and the Bar K2 Ranch at newly formed Raymond. The sugar company acquired 200 horses and 11,740 head of cattle. Beet pulp is a plentiful byproduct of the sugar-making process and much sought-after feed for cattle. In 1902, E.P. decided to build the Ellison Milling and Elevator Company Limited at Raymond. With investors from Utah, he built other milling and elevator plants at McGrath in 1906 and Lethbridge in 1907. In 1908, E.P. reported to the Sugar Company board that they sustained a heavy loss of cattle due to a severe winter. Beets were dug by hand and stacked in rows. And sugar beets were very labor intensive. They were then topped by hand and carted to the factory. This photograph is not of Raymond or Layton, but indicates the amount of hard work that had to go into planting and growing sugar beets. Beets, laborers were hard to find to do field and factory work. A shortage of sugar beets due to growing conditions and the shortage of labor appeared to be the beginning of the end for night sugar. EP sent his oldest son, James E., age 34, who had recently returned from a mission in California, to Raymond to be the resident manager of the factory. James E., his wife Jane Watt Ellison, and their family of 5, Elizabeth, Beatrice, Edward, Aline, and Harold, moved from Layton to Raymond, Alberta. 2 other children, Isabel and David, were born in Raymond. Morris Ellison was head bookkeeper for the Night Sugar Company and heavily involved in the management of the flour mills. Due to a labor shortage, let's see where this takes us. There we go. The Night Sugar Factory. Due to a labor shortage and lack of beets, the board of directors authorized EP to try and sell the factory and lands if he could find a buyer. In 1912, James E. and Morris Ellison traveled to Belgium, Holland, England, and France to recruit workers for the beet fields. EP's 1912 daybook mentions that they arrived back on March the 26th, 1912, with 58 workers. The Ellisons had booked their return trip on the Titanic, but changed their plans and came back early. The Titanic struck an iceberg and sank April 15th, 1912. In a December 1914 board meeting, it was decided that the Night Sugar Factory would be closed and moved to one of 3 sites in Utah: Layton, Spanish Fork, or northern Cache County. A board was formed and to make a decision on where the factory would best be located, and it was decided to move the factory to Layton, Utah, where it would be easier for the Ellisons to manage. They drew up a contract with the Dyer Company on January the 25th, 1915, that would have them move the factory to Layton, Utah, and have it operational on or before the first day of September, also in 1915. This action started a great protest in Raymond against closing and moving the night factory. The move was put on hold. EP and his group had already contracted beets to be grown for the 1915 crop in Layton. So they drew up a new contract with the Dyer Company to provide a totally new factory at Layton. Construction on the new, here we go. Construction on the new 500 ton per day plant began in April of 1915 with an October 1st operation date. The Dyers built this same 500 ton factory design at 5 Utah locations: Elsinore in 1911, Payson in 1913, Layton in 1915, West Jordan and Brigham City in 1916. James E. Ellison and family moved back to Layton in 1915, and he was named to the Sugar Company Board of Directors and General Manager. He remained the general manager for 42 years of Layton Sugar's 44 operating years. Many investors in the Night Sugar Company were also investors in Layton Sugar Company. Shortly after the arrival back in Layton, and I got a little ahead of myself with the pictures, but now we're back. James E. started construction on a new house at 434 West Gentile, where the Ellisons resided from 1916 until the demise of James E. in October 1967. The new house had 8 bedrooms, 2 kitchens, and 3 bathrooms. The same bricklayers that bricked the sugar factory bricked this new home. The factory and the house were all 3 bricks thick, not just brick veneer. Ned and Linda Iverson have lived in the home for the past 40 plus years and have completely restored and modernized it to better than new condition. I think it is one of Layton's best kept secrets. My sister Catherine and I toured the house a few years back and were amazed at what they had done to that house. It's beautiful. The Layton Sugar Company started its first campaign October the 6th, 1915, after having lit the lime kiln on October 2nd. The first sugar was produced on October the 8th. Layton's Mountain Brand sugar was for sale on the shelves of Layton's Farmers Union on October the 13th. The first campaign ended on December the 2nd, and Layton Sugar had produced 58,922 100-pound bags of sugar. Future campaigns would produce nearly 250,000 100-pound bags of sugar per season on a good year, but tended to average closer to 175,000 bags annually during its history. Layton Sugar operated its last campaign in 1958-59 season and was sold to the Utah-Idaho Sugar Company May the 19th of 1959. Utah-Idaho announced that the factory would close and the sugar-making machinery would be removed and used at other plant locations. The Layton warehouse would continue to be used and market Mountain Brand sugar locally. The Night Sugar Factory at Raymond was sold in 1917 to become the West Cache Sugar Company and moved to Cornish, Utah. After a relatively short history, West Cache Sugar was sold to the Amalgamated Sugar Company in 1920. Amalgamated operated it in Cornish until 1928. In 1928, Amalgamated moved the plant to Missoula, Montana, and it was sold again to the American Crystal Sugar Company, and it operated there until 1966. After the new factory is built, and I'm a little bit behind here, the board of directors elects Jesse Knight as its first president in 1915. This particular photograph is not Layton Sugar. It could be, but I'm told it's not. It's the Brigham City Sugar Factory, but it is identical in plan to Layton. So I thought I'd throw it in because it just indicates what it looked like in the early days. And what they're doing is they've just installed the boilers, and they're about to brick around the boilers, and this is one of the stacks that they're about to put up. This is also not Layton, Utah. It's another sugar factory, nearly identical with a few exceptions, and it just shows what construction would have looked like. And also if you'll notice, there are 4 squares at ground level in the front. How they got the beets into the factory was a system of flumes filled with water, wooden flumes filled with water. The beets would come to the factory and they would enter through those openings. And then there was a system of other cement flumes underneath the foundation that led out to the west. Now, I'd heard tales, and I had no information on it. I didn't know about it, so I called my friend Ronnie Layton. And I said, have you ever heard of the sugar factory drain? And he says, oh, yeah, absolutely. And I said, so you own property out where it would have gone, and I've been told that it was an open ditch, and I've never seen anything like that. And yet it had to be something fairly substantial. And he said, well, it was a pipe. It was a big pipe. And it left the sugar factory and somewhere along there made its way over to Gentile. And at Gentile, it went down to 2200 West, and then it went south. And all of this water that's going to the sugar factory to deliver these beets has got to go somewhere. So it went down to 2200 West and dumped into, if you're familiar with that area, it's kind of a swampy area. And for years, the water from Layton Sugar was put out in that area. And Ron tells me, because I've never experienced that or been out there, that it stunk really bad. It's just terrible. So as I questioned him further, come to find out it wasn't just the water draining from the flumes. It was turned into a sewer system, and a lot of the people that lived along West Gentile tied into it. So it was something I didn't know. Jesse Knight resigns his position in 1917 as president so that, he can promote the new Springville Mapleton Sugar Factory. His son, J. William Knight, remains on the board of directors, and E.P. Ellison is elected the new president of Layton Sugar. Just a side note, in 1918, the workers were coming to work at the camp for the campaign with masks on because of the flu epidemic. So it's happened before. In the beginning, Utah-Idaho Sugar Company, Amalgamated Sugar Company, and the Corporation of the President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints seem to be the major stockholders in Layton Sugar, with the Ellisons in overall management positions. During the early years, Amalgamated sold or traded their shares. The sugar factory started experiencing cash flow problems, and the company borrowed money from the LDS Church to meet its obligations. The church requested payment back of that money in the form of treasury stock, and Utah-Idaho appears to have likewise sold or traded any interest they had in Layton Sugar. During the coming years, the Corporation of the President became the majority stockholder at about an estimated 60% of the company stock by the late 1950s. The whereabouts of official company records and whether or not they even exist still is unknown. There's a possibility they're at BYU, and there's a possibility that they're at the Church History Museum. And we haven't really nailed that down at this point. For a relatively small independent company, Layton Sugar appears to have had a mostly successful beginning that really served the community well in providing needed jobs to both seasonal and full-time employees and much needed income to the local farmers. It appears that the community had a great need for the sugar factory that located here. The new factory had a design capability of to slice 500 tons of sugar beets in a 24-hour period. Newspaper reports in November of 1915 report the factory operating at nearly 600 tons per day. Slicing and processing would continue to increase to over 1,300 tons per day by 1958 when it closed. Over the years, and this is the completed factory, the white tent area out front is the temporary machine shop to build the factory. And after a period of time, it was done away with, of course, because they had their own machine shop inside. Over the years, important additions and improvements were made to increase production and efficiency, such as in about 1920, there was a 78-foot addition made to the warehouse. The warehouse, as it was originally built, wasn't large enough for a good run of beets. So they built on relatively soon. In 1936, coal pulverizers were installed on the boilers to allow for cleaner and more efficient use of coal. In 1941, there was the addition of a third white vacuum pan and additional syrup storage tanks. Those pictures are coming up, it looks like. This particular picture on the left is the beet engine, and it's got Bill Day at the throttle wheel and Bert Layton standing next to him. And as what was taking place at this time, the factory is on the kind of the end of the Industrial Revolution. Electric motors are scarce, and the entire factory is run by 1 to 2 steam engines that are stationary. They remain in one place, and they turn an 11-foot flywheel, cast iron flywheel, that weighs about 11,000 pounds. And that flywheel has a face on it that is 23 inches and a belt that is 18 inches that it turns. That belt powers a series of line shafts across the sugar factory on the different floors. And you run a belt off the line shaft to provide power for whatever piece of equipment you need power for. And when you get 11,000 pounds rotating at 125 RPM, it's a force to be reckoned with, and it doesn't stop easily. So they were fairly efficient, and it ran, those two engines, the beet engine and the sugar engine, ran that sugar factory for the entire 44 years. And the only electric motors I remember were in the warehouse on the stackers. In 1947, now this is the back side of this engine that they're standing in front of, and it's not a real good photograph, but this is what they're standing in front of. And that's the 11,000 pound flywheel that the steam engine is turning to generate power for the rest of the factory. The picture on the right is the front of that engine with the crosshead that moves back and forth 36 inches. And I found it was the most interesting thing. I could have watched it all day long. It was just really something to see because everything was so massive and speeding. It was really something that we don't see in this day and age. And these pictures were kind of taken by Evan Ellison and Bill Day before the factory started for the first time, is my understanding from Evan. And I inherited the pictures from Evan after he died. In talking about the coal pulverizer, these pictures were taken in during the first campaign, and you'll notice that the one picture has very little smoke, and the other picture has a big cloud of smoke. The little smoke is the way it should look. They called this smoking the stacks when it really belched out the black coal. And it was done a lot of times for photo ops when they knew the newspapers or somebody that was going to take a picture was coming down. And in 1947, well, getting back to this 1941, we're kind of in a war effort, and there's rumors that we may be involved. And so the war effort is ramping up. Hill Air Force Base is, I guess, here at that time. And beets are hard to come by because everybody needs a place to live. And the farmers are selling off some of their ground to build housing. And sugar beets are still a hard commodity to grow. So Layton Sugar gets a third vacuum pan in 1941. And I've got some pictures here that if we know where they're at, that they, as I've kind of put the newspaper articles together, and my guess is that this vacuum pan came from the Ogden factory of Amalgamated. And Amalgamated closed that plant and moved it to Idaho. This was because of the war effort, and they lost their sugar beets in Weber County. And Layton didn't help because they were over here taking their fair share wherever they could get it. In the fall of 1939, E.P. Ellison dies, and LDS Church Apostle David O. McKay is named the new president and chairman of the board of Layton Sugar. James E. has enjoyed a very long friendship and association with President McKay. James E. was born September the 9th, 1873, and President McKay was born September the 8th, 1873, just one day apart. President McKay would drive to Layton on occasion. That seems hard to imagine, but all by himself, to visit with James E., and they oftentimes celebrated their birthdays together. This continued even after the sale of Layton Sugar in 1959. Additionally, new missionary Harold Ellison is set apart by Apostle David O. McKay in August of 1925 at McKay's home, and they traveled together by train for 6 days en route to the Eastern States mission. And I bring this up to indicate their very close relationship. So David O. McKay was the 9th president of the church from 1951 to 1970. President McKay was also the president at the time of Utah-Idaho Sugar Company from 1951 to 1958. He was chairman of the board of Utah-Idaho from 1958 to 1970. The corporation of the president also held a majority interest in Utah-Idaho Sugar. Utah-Idaho Sugar's management was never considered a friend of Layton Sugar, and they were always kept at arm's length. It was known that their business model was to eliminate the competition. Now, that's not necessarily David O., and I can really see a great relationship going on here. But Layton Sugar was doing things that Utah-Idaho was interested in. And the church is kind of in the middle, if that makes sense. In 1941, Amalgamated moved their factory out of Ogden. And there was talk at that point in time of Amalgamated purchasing Layton Sugar. It appears to have been just talk. But they made a deal with Layton Sugar to process their beets during the 1941, 42, and 43 crops. Additionally, they began dismantling the Ogden factory, and Layton was the recipient of the vacuum pan at least, and one or more beet pilers. That's a little further on, I'm afraid, so I'll go back. Amalgamated made the decision to make their move and get out of the Ogden growing area. And there was also rumor at the time of a new $35 million Navy base that was coming to the district. This Layton Sugar having the opportunity to produce the beets during those 3 years for Amalgamated was a great big boost to Layton Sugar because everybody was running out of beets. In June of 1942, Layton Sugar lost 400 acres of planted beets to the Navy base project, and this was 10% of their total beet acreage. The shortage of beets due to disease or diseased crops or loss of acreage has always been the death knell for most sugar factories. And as I kind of reviewed this with a friend that was writing a report on the last days of the Layton Sugar Company, it became almost kind of clear to me that there was a last-ditch effort made at Layton Sugar to either make it or not make it. And James E. and Harold, as plant manager and superintendent, proposed a plan to President McKay that would remedy the beet shortage problem. And this is speculation on my part. There's no records that exist or anything that tells us this is true. But I think if you look at everything, looking back on all of this, I think it occurred this way. They proposed building an ion exchange plant addition that is large enough to handle the current capacity of the sugar beet campaign, It's 1,350 tons a day, and also use it to process Philippine raw cane sugar purchased from California and shipped to Utah using a special in-transit rate to be applied for from the Interstate Commerce Commission and the Southern Pacific Railroad. It was proposed that the ion exchange plant would be built by the Illinois Water Treatment Company of Rockford, Illinois. Cost, $500,000. Layton Sugar didn't have $500,000. President McKay must have approved the plan, and the corporation, the president, arranged financing of the addition with Salt Lake banks. The ion exchange plant was constructed and operational for the 1947 campaign. Adjustments to the original design and larger, deeper cells were made and changed out, and they changed them out and experimented with them to increase the capacity. Tank cars of molasses were ordered, and sugar was processed from molasses using the ion exchange during the summer months. In 1952, the Ellisons ordered 1,000 long tons of Philippine raw for that campaign and 25,000 long tons for the 1953 campaign. Bag designs were changed to note the ion exchange process on beet sugar, and new bags were produced that would be used for the new Mountain brand cane sugar. The bags were brown and yellow, as I remember, and I haven't seen one since I was a little kid, so if anybody's got one, let me know. Cane sugar produced for this far inland was unheard of and a first in the industry. Ultimately, the ICC denied the application for an in-transit shipping rate, which also included trucking companies. So they didn't want, it almost appeared to be a political situation because they didn't want trucks involved in bringing that raw cane in either. I don't remember the ion exchange operation going after about 1955. Although the ion exchange produced an exceptionally pure sugar, 7-Up Bottling Company and some other large customers complained that the Layton Sugar produced flock in their beverage. The ion exchange process used on beet sugar produced highly pure sugar, except it has, with certain sugars, both cane and beet, produced, especially in soft drinks, a flock-like material, white in color, which in the case of beet sugar settles on the shoulders of the bottle inside. And you'll remember back that 1950s 7-Up was in bottles, and it was really a problem, and so they had to address it. Harold was very familiar with the sugar beet process and the ion exchange process from the recent installation. He rearranges the syrup storage tanks, and using the third white vacuum pan installed in 1941, increases the factory's ability to produce large quantities of bottler sugar without the use of the ion exchange. The ion exchange process is at a conclusion, and the last-ditch effort to create an alternative to the constant sugar beet shortage didn't work as planned. In 1954, sugar beet growers in Burley, Idaho, have a disagreement with Amalgamated Sugar, and Layton Sugar is able to incorporate in Idaho and contract with the growers for about 2,500 acres of beets to be shipped by rail to Layton. That happened all the years I remember as a little kid. going to Idaho, arranging for the beets, and they would come down by rail to be processed. It increased the campaign by probably at least 3 weeks and made for a profitable situation. After the closure in 1959, the beets were processed from Idaho, were processed at the Garland, Utah plant, and Utah, Idaho considered it a very valuable asset to them to have those 2,500 acres. Everybody was still hurting for beets. Just about through here, and several historians have written about the state of church finances in the late 1950s. In an attempt to strengthen church finances and provide needed changes in investing and spending, President McKay named William F. Edwards a successful financier and later Dean of Education and Vice President of Finance at BYU as a financial secretary to the first presidency. That happened in January of 1957. Dr. Edwards immediately went to work on a list of perceived church investments and church-held businesses. Beneficial Life Insurance, Zion's Bank, and the Layton Sugar Company seemed to be a good place to start. In November of 1957, he sends a memo to President McKay and others that outlines Layton's situation and makes recommendations. He recommends that the factory be closed and beets that they've already contracted for be processed either by UNI or amalgamated. And in January of that same time period, President McKay instructs Edwards to proceed with his recommendations. Edwards sets up a special board meeting January 31st, 1958. President McKay resigns as Layton Sugar president and chairman of the board. He's replaced by Harold Ellison as president and Anton Ivins as chairman of the board. Two new board members are elected. Dr. Edwards was named as an advisor to the management of Layton Sugar Company. The campaign of 1958 was considered very successful and produced over 200,000 100-pound bags of bottler's quality sugar. It would appear that the campaign of 1958 would be the last for Layton Sugar. Dr. Edwards arranged the sale of Layton Sugar to Utah, Idaho. That was effective May the 3rd, 1959. Conditions of the agreement required that 90% of Layton's shareholders surrendered their certificates by May the 18th. The offer was for $66.50 a share for the 7,518 shares, or $500,000, which was half of the stock's current value. Layton Sugar and Mountain Brown Sugar became a wholly owned subsidiary of UNI Sugar Incorporated. The factory was closed and UNI began the process of demolition of the sugar-making equipment almost immediately, removal. In my estimation, Layton Sugar would not have continued on to 1958 or 1959 had it not been without the help and support of President McKay. There's another kind of interesting side note to that. By getting them $500,000 worth of financing to build this ion exchange, it was a big ion exchange. It wasn't a small one like had been built other places. And the Utah-Idaho management, they're sitting over here watching what Layton Sugar's doing, very interested, because if this plan would work for Layton Sugar, it may also work for them. And I kind of see where, as President McKay is having board meetings in a couple of different places, there's really a good chance that they're saying, I think you ought to do it. Maybe they'll be successful, and they